Welcome to Mind Sherlock. Today's case hides its truth in the smellest corner. The clues begin quietly, but the journey is unforgettable. Let us get started.
The rain falls endlessly over London tonight. Soft, deliberate, as if the city itself were whispering secrets through every dripping eave. In the glow of the gas lamps, carriages rattle over slick cobblestones, and somewhere beyond the fog, the doors of the Strand Theatre are closing on a tragedy no audience could ever have imagined. It is a tale of art and obsession, of love that curdled into authorship, and of a playwright whose final act blurred the line between performance and truth. Before we step into the quiet streets and the restless mind of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, tell me, where in the world are you listening from this evening? And what hour strikes upon your own clock? I'd love to know. Now, the lamps are dimmed, the city holds its breath, and a mystery waits behind the curtain. The rain keeps falling, and so our story begins. The night had drawn its heavy cloak over London, and a fine mist clung to the gas lamps that lined the Strand like weary sentinels guarding the heart of the city. Our cab rattled along the shining cobblestones, the horses' hooves sending up a rhythm that seemed to echo the pulse of that restless district. Theatres, music halls, and supper rooms glowed behind their frosted windows, while the cries of cabmen and the rustle of evening gowns mingled with the distant hum of applause. Holmes, leaning slightly forward, peered through the fogged pane with that quiet intensity of his, as though the very mist carried some secret worth deciphering. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "how mankind builds its illusions upon a scaffold of smoke and gaslight." I smiled, accustomed to his philosophical turns, though I little suspected that before the night's end, his words would acquire so grim a significance. When we alighted before the Strand Theatre, the great doors were alive with departing patrons, their chatter and laughter rising like the afterglow of a performance. It was, as I would soon learn, an applause not yet concluded, for fate had reserved its final act for us. Within the theatre, warmth and brilliance struck us like a sudden tide. Chandeliers glimmered above tiers of gilded balconies, and the murmur of the crowd swelled once more into applause as the curtain fell upon the final act of the Winter Harp, the newest triumph of Sir Alaric Dane, the celebrated playwright. Yet even as the company bowed, I felt a strange flutter pass through the audience, a ripple of confusion that spread like a tremor across still water. Faces turned upward. A woman cried out. The clapping faltered and then ceased altogether. The orchestra stumbled to a halt. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. A figure had collapsed in one of the private boxes, a pale form slumped against crimson velvet. Holmes's expression altered from mild curiosity to alert precision in the span of a breath. "Remain composed, Watson," he said quietly. "It appears that tragedy has chosen to extend the evening's entertainment." We had scarcely risen from our seats when a familiar, brisk voice cut through the commotion. "Holmes! By all that's fortunate you're here." Inspector Lestrade, flushed and harried, pushed through the throng with the determination of a man who sees order slipping from his grasp. "A woman's been taken ill, or worse. The manager says it's Lady Dane, the playwright's wife." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Lead the way, Lestrade. If the lady is dead, then she will not be revived by speculation." The crowd parted before us, whispering as we passed. I could feel the collective breath of curiosity pressing upon our backs, as if the entire theatre held its lungs in suspense. Holmes walked swiftly, his long stride cutting through the confusion with the assurance of one who has already begun to assemble the puzzle in his mind. The private box lay in subdued half-light, its heavy draperies muffling both sound and air. The scene within was curiously still. Mrs. Clara Dane sat motionless in her chair, her head slightly bowed, as though listening to the echo of the applause that had just died away. Yet her pallor, the faint blue at the lips, and the unnatural rigidity of her hands left no doubt as to her state. Holmes moved forward noiselessly, his gaze travelling from the figure to the small table beside her and back again. "A peaceful death," murmured Lestrade, crossing himself instinctively. Holmes gave a faint shake of his head. Peaceful, perhaps, but seldom are peace and truth acquainted in such company. He bent lower, studying the delicate gloves, the faint dust upon her sleeve, the minute distortion of her posture. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "the curtain has fallen, but not upon art." It was Holmes who first noticed the scrap of paper clenched within the lady's left hand. He drew it gently free and held it up to the lamplight. It was a torn playbill, creased, smudged, and ripped neatly down the middle. "Curious," he murmured. "One half only." Turning it over, he examined the edges where the tear had occurred. A deliberate act, not accident. Someone wished to separate two things that belonged together. Lestrade shrugged impatiently. A trifle, surely. The poor creature might have torn it in her fall. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A trifle, yes. But trifle and truth are cousins, Inspector. Let us see whether the other half of this bill reappears, and under what circumstances. I noted that he placed it carefully within his pocketbook before resuming his survey of the box. On the table beside Mrs. Dane's seat stood a crystal wineglass, half in shadow. Its contents, untouched, glimmered faintly in the light from the stage below. I leaned closer. "She has not drunk a drop," I observed. Strange, when one is supposedly in distress. Holmes nodded. "Indeed, Watson. Grief seldom leaves a full glass behind." He examined the rim with his magnifying lens. No residue, no lip, mark. The wine was placed before her, perhaps to lend the scene a certain verisimilitude, but not to be consumed. We are looking at something arranged. "You mean staged?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Quite literally." Holmes's expression grew intent as he leaned over the lady's gloves, his nostrils dilating slightly. "Do you detect it, Watson? A faint scent, sweet, yet with a bitterness beneath it. Something floral, yet cruel." I bent closer, but caught nothing beyond the faint odour of theatre dust and faded perfume. "I fear my senses are unequal to yours," I admitted. Holmes straightened. "Few are," he said lightly. Then, after a pause, "This is not the perfume of fashion. It is chemical, designed to mask something far more sinister. Mark me, Watson, the cause of death was neither despair nor heartache." His eyes flickered toward Lestrade. "You may inform your men that the case of Lady Dane's sudden death has become a matter for the living, not the dead." Outside, the night had thickened. The theatre doors released a stream of murmuring figures, who vanished one by one into the pale fog. Holmes and I emerged among them, the cool air carrying the mingled scents of rain, gaslight, and distant horses. For a moment, he paused upon the pavement, his gaze turned back toward the great building now silent behind us. "A remarkable performance," he said softly. "And yet, the finest act is still to come." "You think, then, that the matter is not as it appears?" I asked. He smiled in that dry, inscrutable manner of his. "My dear Watson, appearances are the author's privilege, and deceit his trade. The stage has merely changed, but the play continues." With that, he hailed a passing cab, and together we vanished once more into the London mist. The great hall of the Strand Theatre, so lately vibrant with music and applause, now lay shrouded in a kind of reverent gloom. One by one, the patrons had withdrawn, leaving behind the faint scent of crushed violets and candle smoke. The chandeliers were dimmed, and the rows of empty seats stood like a silent congregation awaiting benediction. Holmes remained motionless beside me, his gaze fixed upon the curtained stage as though he listened to echoes inaudible to any mortal ear. "Observe, Watson," he said softly, "how swiftly triumph curdles into tragedy. The hand that shapes illusion may also summon death His voice carried neither judgment nor surprise, merely the weary recognition of yet another human drama concealed beneath the veneer of civility. I watched the last attendants extinguish the gas jets, their steps muffled by dusted carpets, and the silence that followed seemed to press upon us with a weight all its own. "Come," said Holmes at last, his eyes gleaming in the half-light. "The actors have left the stage, but not all the parts have been played." We passed behind the heavy crimson draperies into the maze of the theatres, backstage passages, where the splendour of the audience's world gave way to ropes, pulleys, and paint-stained boards. The air was thick with the mingled odours of grease paint and damp wood. Here, Holmes moved with quiet purpose, speaking briefly to the stagehands who lingered over their tasks. His questions, mild yet precise, drew forth reluctant confessions and glances exchanged like guilty signals. It seemed the troupe was bound less by loyalty than by envy. One actor muttering of missed cues, another of scenes rewritten to favour a rival. The name of Evelyn March, Mrs. Dane's understudy, recurred with particular frequency, accompanied by that half-pitying tone, the mediocre reserve for the gifted. "Jealousy," murmured Holmes when we were alone again. "It haunts the theatre as surely as dust haunts its curtains. Yet jealousy, by itself, seldom kills. It merely provides the motive for those who will." Evelyn March awaited us in a small antechamber off the corridor, her pale features half concealed beneath a netted veil. She started visibly when Holmes entered, clasping her hands so tightly that the lace tore at the knuckles. I have told the inspector all I know," she began, her voice trembling between pride and fear. Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, Miss March, but perhaps there is something you have not realized you know." His tone was courteous, yet there was a quiet insistence beneath it that seemed to draw her every breath into scrutiny. Her account of the evening faltered at certain points, the interval between acts, the moment she last saw Mrs. Dane, the errand that took her briefly to the property room. "You seem uncertain, Miss March," Holmes observed gently. "Was it before or after the curtain call that you left your place?" She hesitated, and the faintest tremor crossed her lips. "Before," she said at last. I went to fetch a wrap." Holmes bowed slightly, his expression unreadable. When she had gone, he turned to me. "A wrap, Watson, is a useful thing, to conceal more than shoulders." Holmes returned to the box where Mrs. Dane's body had been found. The debris of the tragedy lay scattered still, a crushed bouquet, a fan, and the torn playbill we had seen earlier. As he lifted it to the light, I noticed a faint residue clinging to its surface, glimmering like frost upon the paper. "Powder," Holmes murmured, "but not of the sort employed by actors." Producing his lens, he examined the edges closely before folding the playbill within a clean envelope. "A small thing," he said. "But small things, Watson, are the hinges upon which great doors of truth swing open." I knew better than to interrupt, for he handled the object with a reverence I had seen only when he suspected some subtle trace invisible to others. "Later, in Baker Street, we shall learn whether this residue belongs to art or to murder." He next turned his attention to Mrs. Dane's gloves, which had been laid neatly upon the armrest of her chair. Lifting one delicately, he brought it close to his face. "You perceive it, Watson?" "No, of course you do not. It is faint, elusive, but most peculiar." He held the glove between thumb and forefinger, his nostrils flaring. "Not perfume, not powder. Something floral but unnatural, manufactured. I have encountered it before." His brow contracted in thought, then smoothed again. A clever disguise for something deadly. You see, the hand that adorned itself in elegance may also have been guided to its own destruction. I shuddered, glancing toward the place where the body had rested. Holmes replaced the glove gently, as though reluctant to disturb the memory it carried. "It is always the smallest vanities," he said, "that leave the largest graves." Our inquiries continued among the company, who now awaited us in the green room. Their manner was outwardly courteous, yet beneath every word I sensed unease. Smiles lingered a moment too long. Laughter broke too readily and died too soon. They addressed one another with polished phrases, but the glances that followed were sharp as knives. "Do you not see it, Watson?" whispered Holmes beside me. "They play even now, a second performance, meant for our eyes alone." I observed that one gentleman, a leading actor of some reputation, spoke of Mrs. Dane with a show of tenderness too emphatic to be sincere, while another woman's condolences trembled on the verge of glee. Holmes listened, nodding politely, his gaze flicking from gesture to gesture, as if reading an invisible script. "The stage, my dear fellow," he murmured, "is not confined to the boards. We are forever its audience." When at last we withdrew from the theatre, I noted a sombre cast upon my friend's features that I had seldom seen. He walked in silence for some minutes, his brows drawn and his steps slow. At length I ventured to speak. "You are disturbed, Holmes." He stopped and looked at me, and in the lamplight his eyes appeared darker than usual, less brilliant, more human. "Disturbed, yes," he admitted. "For the truth here is not born of artifice or intellect, but of the human heart. That, Watson, is the most dangerous instrument of all. It composes tragedies no stage could ever contain." His words lingered with me as we turned into the misty street beyond, the echo of applause now long extinguished, leaving only the quiet, uneasy murmur of London at midnight. The Dane residence stood upon a quiet crescent of Bloomsbury, its facade of pale stone gleaming faintly beneath the evening lamps. As our cab drew near, I was struck by the curious stillness that seemed to cling to the place. No servant stirred, no curtain fluttered. The windows shone dimly from within, as though the very light feared to intrude. Within, the air was scented faintly of wax and roses gone dry with neglect. Every surface bespoke taste and prosperity, the velvet draperies, the marble busts of Greek tragedians, the tall pianoforte glimmering in the half-light. Yet the impression it left was not of life, but of performance concluded. "A house of applause, now silent," Holmes murmured, his sharp gaze roaming the room. And like most applause, I suspect it was never entirely sincere. As our host approached from the adjoining chamber, his tread soft upon the carpet, I felt as though a ghost of the theatre itself had come forth to greet us. Sir Alaric Dane was a man whose every gesture seemed composed for an unseen audience. He greeted us with the gravity of one accustomed to both admiration and pity, his dark hair brushed neatly back from a pale and thoughtful brow. "You find me, gentlemen," he said with a faint sigh, "in the ruins of my happiness. My poor Clara was a creature too finely strung for this coarse world. Her heart, her heart was her undoing." He led us to a pair of armchairs before the fire, his voice flowing like that of an actor reciting lines he had perfected. "She felt too deeply, Mr. Holmes. My art was her mirror. She could not bear the reflection." I noted that Holmes made no reply, save a faint inclination of the head. Sir Alaric continued, lowering his tone to a confessional murmur. "Her death was inevitable, the final act of a weary soul. She simply chose her moment upon the stage she knew best." His words hung in the air, elegant and hollow as the applause he so often courted. As he spoke, Holmes's eyes moved about the room, pausing at the mantelpiece where a tall mirror caught the glow of the fire. Its surface was marred by a fine crack, running diagonally across one corner. A flaw slight, yet conspicuous, amid so much order. Holmes's gaze lingered upon it, then shifted briefly to Sir Alaric's face. I saw his hand move, almost unconsciously, to his pocket, where he often kept his notebook, though he did not yet draw it forth. "A pity," said Holmes softly, "how beauty is most often marred from within rather than without." Dane turned with a half-smile that did not reach his eyes. "A sentiment worthy of poetry, Mr. Holmes," he said. My companion bowed slightly. "Or of truth, Sir Alaric," he replied, and the playwright's expression flickered for an instant before resuming its composure. Holmes requested permission to examine Sir Alaric's working study, and our host, after a brief hesitation, led us to a room lined with manuscripts and proofs. Sheets of half-corrected plays lay strewn across the desk, along with quills, pencils, and a small bronze lamp whose light trembled upon the margins. Holmes began to turn the pages with careful fingers, his eyes tracing the lines not of dialogue, but of handwriting. "Curious," he murmured. "Do you observe, Watson, the interplay of hands? Here, this bold, sweeping stroke belongs to Dane. But this finer, more graceful annotation, see the curve of the letters. It belongs to another." He lifted a page toward the light. "The two styles meet here upon the same line. They correct one another. Two minds, two temperaments, collaborating, perhaps contending." I nodded, struck by the poignancy of that mingled script. "She wrote upon his work," I said quietly. "Or he upon hers," Holmes replied. "The question, my dear Watson, is which hand struck the final word." Throughout our conversation, Sir Alaric maintained a poise that I could not but admire, though it chilled me more than it moved me. His courtesy was unfailing. He offered us tea, smiled faintly at my inquiries, and expressed gratitude for Holmes's interest in domestic misfortune. Yet beneath this polish, I detected a curious detachment, as if his grief were a part performed long ago and now rehearsed by habit. His eyes, for all their brightness, never softened when his wife's name was mentioned. They seemed fixed upon some invisible audience only he could see. When I ventured a word of sympathy, he inclined his head in gracious acceptance, as though receiving applause after a well-delivered soliloquy. "The living," he said lightly, "must find comfort where they may. For me, that comfort lies in work." Holmes gave a brief, dry nod. "And yet," he said, "work has been known to betray its creator." The faintest flicker passed across Dane's mouth, a smile perhaps, or a tremor. I could not tell which. Holmes rose presently, and with that gentleness which always masked his deepest curiosity, inquired whether any of Mrs. Dane's personal letters or notes remained in the house. "I have reason to believe," he said, "that her hand may yet speak in ways her voice could not. A letter, even a fragment, sometimes reveals more than a confession." Dane hesitated, his fingers tightening upon the arm of his chair. "My wife was a private woman, Mr. Holmes. She valued her correspondence as she did her soul." Holmes bowed slightly. "All the more reason to consult it, Sir Alaric, for both may have been violated." The playwright gave a low, constrained laugh. "You speak as though you suspect sacrilege." "I speak," Holmes replied calmly, "as one who observes it often." The silence that followed was broken only by the faint ticking of a clock upon the mantel. At length Dane rose. "Very well," he said. "If it will aid your inquiry, I shall show you what remains." He led us to a small writing room adjoining the study. A heavy escritoire stood beneath the window, its surface veiled with dust and the faint outline of long-absent papers. The key, which he produced from a chain at his waist, turned reluctantly in the lock, as though resenting the intrusion. When the lid lifted, a subtle fragrance drifted upward. The ghost of violets mingled with something sadder and more elusive. "She was fond of the scent," Dane said softly. Holmes bent forward, his keen eyes glancing over the contents: folded papers tied with ribbon, a silver penknife, and a few envelopes sealed and unaddressed. "Curious," he murmured, "how the dead preserve their secrets even in the manner of their dust." Dane's hand trembled slightly as he drew back. "I had meant to destroy them," he said, "but I could not." "No," said Holmes quietly. "Destruction is a privilege reserved for the innocent." From among the letters, Holmes withdrew one in particular, a page partially scorched at the edges, the ink pale but legible. He read in silence for several minutes, then passed it to me. The handwriting, flowing, graceful, spoke of weariness rather than fear. It ended with a line that struck cold upon the heart. Art has no mercy, and love less still. Holmes laid the page upon the desk and regarded it thoughtfully. Genius, he said at length, seldom murders by impulse. It edits first. There was in his tone a mingling of admiration and warning, as though he had glimpsed in Sir Alaric's work not merely art, but its consequence. Come, Watson, he added, slipping the letter into his pocket. We have read the preface. It is time we turn to the final act. And as we left the room, I saw Dane standing motionless by the mirror, his reflection split by the fracture that crossed its glass. A man divided, and perhaps condemned by his own creation. The fire in Sir Alaric Dane's study had burned low, casting a dim red glow upon the escritoire where Holmes stood, his long fingers tracing the grain of the mahogany. The room bore the same air of elegant decay that marked its owner, a mingling of refinement and ruin. I had thought our investigation concluded for the night, but Holmes's gaze was fixed upon the hearth, where the faint scent of burnt paper lingered. Observe, Watson, he murmured. Our host's zeal for tidiness has not extended to completeness. I followed his glance. Amid the fine grey ash within the grate lay a few blackened edges, their curled corners still faintly glowing. Holmes took up the poker and stirred the remains with delicate precision. Paper, recently destroyed, yet not consumed. His tone was almost clinical. Our dramatist has burnt something more than drafts this evening. He knelt to examine the embers, his face illuminated by the dull glow. Warm still, he said softly, and in that warmth, the echo of guilt. Bring me the tongs, Watson. The last act of our play lies hidden here, and the author thought to close the curtain too soon. With the care of a surgeon preserving fragile tissue, Holmes lifted a fragment from the grate, placing it upon the polished desk. The edges were brittle, and much of the writing had vanished into ash, yet a few words, scratched by a fine feminine hand, remained discernible amid the ruin. He moistened his finger, gently clearing the soot. A letter, he said, and not an old one. You see how the ink resists the fire. Recent composition. He held it to the light. The words. Ah, yes. My voice has been stolen. I leaned closer, the sentence chilling me with its despair. A suicide note, I ventured. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. A confession of despair, yes, but not necessarily self-destruction. The tone is that of one silenced, not self-slain. Fetch that envelope from the escritoire drawer, Watson. It may yet yield the missing phrases. I did so, my hands clumsy with anticipation, while Holmes's eyes glimmered like those of a man listening to music only he could hear. Piece by piece, Holmes began to reconstruct the torn message. The room fell utterly still, save for the soft rustle of scorched paper and the occasional crackle from the fire. It is the hand of Mrs. Dane, Holmes said at last. She writes not to accuse, but to lament. The phrasing is theatrical, yet sincere. My voice has been stolen. I am made to speak words not my own, each thought corrected, each feeling rehearsed. He straightened, the fragment trembling between his fingers. Do you not see, Watson? It is the voice of a woman who has ceased to belong to herself. The author writes, but the husband dictates. I could not suppress a shiver. Then she felt imprisoned. Holmes nodded slowly. In body, perhaps not. In spirit, most assuredly. There are prisons with walls of ink, my dear fellow, and the key is flattery. He gathered the remains as though piecing together the skeleton of an extinct creature. This letter will serve as her resurrection. I confess that I saw in the words only the outpouring of a wounded heart. Surely, Holmes, I began, such phrases may be the mere dramatics of an unhappy wife. Theatrical folk, after all, are bred to speak in metaphor. Holmes looked up sharply. A metaphor, yes, but tell me, Watson, what is art if not the refuge of truth disguised? A symbol, when drawn by the guilty, is merely confession wearing a mask. His tone softened as he turned again to the fragment. Mrs. Dane's sorrow may have been penned in allegory, but allegory bleeds through the ink when the author's hand trembles. He folded the pieces neatly, his eyes clouded in thought. There is intent here. The act of writing was her rebellion, the act of burning his correction. His words lingered in the stillness, and I began to understand that this letter was not the end of a story, but its buried beginning. Holmes's attention was next drawn to a small globule of red upon the paper's corner. He touched it lightly, then examined his fingertip under the lamp. "Sealing wax," he murmured, "and not of common origin." Fetching his magnifying lens, he studied the residue with growing concentration. "Note the hue, Watson. A deep Venetian red, not the English crimson we see in ordinary use. And here, pressed faintly into the surface, the outline of a crest, crossed laurel branches enclosing a single star. Remarkably, the same device appears upon a note we discovered earlier in Miss March's dressing room. I recalled the paper, unsigned and perfumed, found among the actress's belongings. Then there is a connection. Holmes smiled faintly. Connection, yes. Collusion, perhaps. A playwright's world is small, but his intrigues are vast. One prop, one letter, one misplaced seal. These are but lines in the same drama. The hand that sealed this letter also directed the scene of death. Holmes worked in silence for several minutes, aligning fragments of the burnt paper upon the desk with the patience of a monk, illuminating a manuscript. "There," he said finally. "Observe how the phrases overlap. My voice has been stolen. I speak only what he writes. I am not alive but performed." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Watson, we are not reading a lament. We are reading an autopsy of the soul." His voice dropped. "Sir Alaric Dane has edited his wife's existence as one edits a line too bright for the stage. He rewrote her until she vanished. I could not help my protest. Surely, Holmes, you cannot infer murder from metaphor." He regarded me gravely. "Murder, my dear Watson, begins in thought long before it seeks its method. A playwright who edits the truth as he edits his lines may come, in time, to edit life itself." He gathered the papers into his case, the lamplight reflecting in his eyes. "We shall let the ink speak once more before the night is done." When Holmes at last departed the study to seek fresh air, I remained behind, reluctant to follow. The fire had died to embers, and the silence of the house pressed heavily upon me. I found myself gazing at the delicate ashes on the hearth, the faint gleam of the poker, the traces of her handwriting upon the desk. In that dim glow, I felt anew the peculiar cruelty of intellect ungoverned by compassion, the cold violence that leaves no wound. I thought of Mrs. Dane's quiet despair, of Evelyn March's trembling smile, of the brittle charm of Sir Alaric himself. It struck me that murder need not always spill blood. Some crimes are written in silence and staged before an audience of one. The theatre of genius, I reflected, was often lit by the embers of those it consumed. And as I extinguished the final flame, I could not help but wonder whether Holmes, in his relentless pursuit of reason, ever feared that same chill fire in himself. The theatre loomed before us, like a relic from some forgotten dream, its facade dim beneath the smothered glow of the gas lamps. Within, the air hung heavy with the scent of dust, grease paint, and extinguished applause. It was past midnight, and yet Evelyn March awaited us upon the stage, a solitary figure haloed by the ghostly shimmer of a single footlight. Her poise was admirable, but even from the shadows where Holmes and I stood, I discerned a tremor beneath that graceful stillness, as if the mask of her profession could no longer bear the weight of its deception. She turned as we approached, her gown rustling faintly. "I knew you would come, Mr. Holmes," she said in a low, steady voice that trembled only on its final syllable. Holmes inclined his head. "It is the nature of unfinished performances, Miss March, that they demand an encore. Her eyes widened a fraction, but she said nothing. I thought then that I had never seen courage and fear so strangely intertwined upon a single countenance. Seated upon a trunk of costumes, Evelyn began her recital with the poise of one long accustomed to an audience. She spoke clearly, even delicately, yet there was an artfulness in her phrasing that betrayed rehearsal. "I was near the wings when Lady Dane entered her box," she said, "though I saw little of her until the commotion began. I remember Sir Alaric's expression, one of horror, but also relief, perhaps. He loved her, of course, but she was delicate." Her voice faltered almost imperceptibly on that last word. Holmes said nothing, but his gaze did not waver. "I heard the cry," she continued quickly, and ran toward the stage door. There was confusion, stage hands shouting, the curtain half lowered, the audience in an uproar. It was chaos. Her hands twisted the lace handkerchief she held. "I thought only of helping." "Indeed," said Holmes softly. "And yet you recall the chaos with remarkable structure, Miss March, like dialogue from a play you know too well." She drew in a breath, but offered no reply. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his tone almost gentle. "You cared deeply for Sir Alaric Dane." The statement was not a question, and for a moment she did not meet his eyes. Then she straightened, the fragile defiance of truth trembling upon her lips. "Yes," she said at last, "I loved him. I do not deny it. I loved him for his brilliance, for the fire in his words, and for the gentleness he once showed her." She clasped her hands as though to steady herself. "But that gentleness died long before she did. Clara Dane was a ghost long before she left this world. I pitied her. Truly, I did." Her eyes glistened in the dim light, yet no tear fell. "When I saw her in that box, so pale, so still, it seemed inevitable. The final tragedy of a heart too long forsaken." "And yet," said Holmes quietly, "every tragedy has its author, Miss March." Her composure wavered, and I saw for the first time genuine fear flicker through the mask. Holmes's manner changed almost imperceptibly, his voice adopting that tone of mild inquiry which so often preceded revelation. "You say the curtain had begun to lower when the alarm was raised. Tell me, Miss March, at what precise minute did the final act conclude?" Evelyn blinked, unprepared for the question. "It was, surely just before 10. The play always ended near that hour." "Always?" Holmes repeated, his brows lifting slightly. "Even on a night of tragedy?" She hesitated, searching memory or invention. "It was, yes, perhaps a few minutes after. I cannot be certain." Holmes nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You will forgive me. Precision is a vice of mine. The theatre, like life, is measured in moments. One misplaced and the illusion collapses. Please, continue." She resumed her tale, though now her words came haltingly, as if each syllable were weighed and found wanting. It was not long before Holmes's quiet persistence bore fruit. "You told Inspector Lestrade," he said mildly, "that you were behind the wings when Mrs. Dane's collapse was discovered. Yet if the curtain fell at 10 minutes past, and you had left the stage at 5 before, then by your own account, you could not have been where you claim." Evelyn's breath caught. I must have mistaken the time." "Possibly," said Holmes, his tone still courteous. "Yet you remember so clearly the chaos, the curtain, even Sir Alaric's expression. How curious that the clock alone escapes recollection." Her hand went to her throat. "You think I lied?" Holmes regarded her steadily. "I think you are elsewhere, Miss March, and that your fear this evening is not of discovery, but of conscience." She rose abruptly, trembling. "You cannot prove—" "No," said Holmes, "and I have no wish to. The truth, like the theatre, is a matter of timing, and yours, I fear, was off by precisely 5 minutes." She sank back into her seat, her face ashen. Lestrade, who had been standing discreetly in the wings, took a step forward. "Shall I have her detained, Mr. Holmes?" But Holmes raised a hand. "No, Inspector. Miss March is guilty only of misdirection, not of malice." She lied, yes, but in defense of a man whose shadow she mistook for the sun. Evelyn looked up sharply, confusion and gratitude mingling in her eyes. Holmes continued, addressing me rather than her. Not every liar is a murderer, Watson, though every truth hides one. Her deception was born of devotion, not cruelty. To love genius is a perilous occupation, and often fatal to sincerity. He turned to Lestrade with a faint sigh. Let her go. She has suffered enough in applause unearned and affection unreturned. I saw then a rare melancholy in his expression, as though he pitied her even more than the dead. Evelyn whispered something, a sound like thanks, and fled into the shadows, her footsteps fading among the curtains. Holmes lingered upon the stage, his gaze sweeping over the props and costumes scattered across the boards. Curious, he murmured. One item short of a full set. He motioned for the property master's ledger, which lay open upon a nearby stool. Running his finger down the list, he stopped abruptly. Here. Vial, glass, clear, containing coloured water. Act 3. He turned the page. No note of its return. Lestrade frowned. A prop, perhaps taken as a souvenir. Or as an instrument, said Holmes quietly, in a scene whose script has not yet been published. He stooped, examining the stage table where the object had once stood. A missing vial, a false alibi, a playwright's wife dead before her cue, all parts of the same composition. Straightening, he closed the ledger with a snap. Come, Watson, the final act awaits its author, and I fear his pen is far from idle. We stepped into the cold night, the theatre behind us, dimming once more into silence, its secrets lingering like perfume upon an empty stage. The morning after our return from the theatre found Holmes in his element, seated at our familiar table in Baker Street, surrounded by manuscripts, letters, and a clutter of scientific instruments that gleamed faintly in the firelight. Outside, a thin mist drifted along Baker Street, muffling the rattle of wheels. Within, all was quiet save for the soft rustle of paper beneath Holmes's deft hands. Observe, Watson, he said, spreading the late Sir Alaric Dane's annotated script across the desk. Truth, like art, leaves its revisions behind. It is our privilege to read them. I noted the care with which he handled each page, as though the ink itself were capable of whispering confession. This play, he continued, is not merely the author's creation. It is his confession, written under the guise of genius. The margins swam with annotations in two distinct hands, one forceful and commanding, the other delicate, tremulous. As he turned the pages, the brittle paper sighed softly, and I found myself strangely chilled. We are not reading dialogue, my dear fellow, Holmes murmured, but a dialogue with death. Holmes invited me to read aloud certain passages, his lean form reclining in shadow as he listened with half-closed eyes. The lines were hauntingly prophetic, a woman's cry from the stage declaring her love, a poison sweet enough to kill, followed by a stage direction. She falls, smiling faintly, as the music swells. I paused, unsettled. Good heavens, Holmes, it mirrors her death precisely. He gestured for me to continue, his expression one of grim absorption. This was written months before the event, I exclaimed, yet every word fits the reality. Holmes steepled his fingers. It fits because the author ensured that reality would fit it. Consider, Watson, the vanity of a man who sought to make life his masterpiece. He composed not merely dialogue, but destiny. He leaned forward, his gaze upon the page. A mind thus intoxicated by its own creation ceases to distinguish artifice from existence. What is performed becomes what is lived. And when applause fades, murder becomes the final encore. Holmes's finger traced a faint, looping hand in the margin, a softer script, distinct from Sir Alaric's bold scrawl. You perceive this, Watson? He asked. The delicate hand of a woman, Mrs. Dane herself. Note the phrasing. I fear he no longer invents, but rewrites reality. The play has entered him, and I am its casualty." He looked up sharply. "Remarkable, is it not? A confession within a confession, hidden in plain sight." I felt an ache of pity stir within me. "She knew," I murmured. "She foresaw it." Holmes nodded gravely. "Genius, Watson, has a peculiar cruelty. It consumes those too near its flame." In her gentleness, she mistook his obsession for inspiration. When she realized that he no longer created from life, but forced life to imitate his creation, it was too late. The pen had become a weapon. His gaze softened as he examined the loops of her signature, faint as a breath. "She wrote to warn herself," he said, "and left her epitaph instead." For some moments Holmes remained silent, his eyes upon the script. Then, in a tone both analytical and sad, he said, "It is the margin that interests me, Watson, the space where the human soul leaves its smudges. Here lies the proof that admiration may curdle into tyranny. What begins as adoration ends as possession. The artist sees not the beloved, but the reflection of his own genius upon her face. When she ceases to mirror him perfectly, he breaks the glass." His hand hovered above the manuscript as though reluctant to touch it further. "This note, fragile as it is, represents her final act of rebellion, the faint resistance of truth against authorship." I observed the faint tremor of fatigue about his eyes. The case had affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. "You look troubled, Holmes," I ventured. "Not troubled, Watson," he replied quietly, "merely reminded that intellect untempered by conscience is the most efficient of poisons." Turning from philosophy to method, Holmes fetched his chemical kit and arranged the manuscript beneath the light. "Let us see," he said briskly, "what ink may confess when the pen refuses." He applied a thin reagent to the darker smudges along the margin, watching as faint discolorations bloomed across the page. "A faint oily residue," he observed. "Notice how the ink thickens at the edges of the script. This was no common carbon compound." He added a drop of reagent. The paper hissed faintly. "Aconitine," he pronounced. "Extracted from the monkshood plant, a subtle toxin, leaving paralysis of the heart and a mask of tranquility upon the face. The perfect death for one accustomed to the stage." I stared at him in disbelief. "Then she was poisoned through her own hand?" "Through her husband's," Holmes corrected. "And with the very instrument that made his name. The alchemy of ink and vanity, Watson. Deadlier than any dagger." His eyes glinted. Art and chemistry, strange allies in the theatre of crime. Holmes now laid before me a separate item, a printed copy of Sir Alaric's latest play, its dedication inscribed in flowing script. "To my beloved Clara, whose heart has inspired every word." He examined it with his glass, then drew forth a scalpel, slicing delicately along the edge of the inscription. "Observe the luster," he said, scraping the faint residue. "The ink used here differs from that of the text. He brewed it himself." A moment later, he held a reagent-stained cloth toward the lamp. It flared a dull violet. "Aconitine again," he said simply. "He poisoned her not through the glass nor the glove, but through the very words of affection." Each letter written was a fraction of her death. I could scarcely speak. But why, Holmes? What purpose could such monstrous subtlety serve? Holmes replaced the inscription gently. "Purpose, my dear fellow. Only pride." He desired his tragedy to be perfect, to unite art and life in one sublime deceit. Her death was his final line, written in the ink of immortality. Holmes leaned back, the playbill before him, and regarded it with a peculiar melancholy. "There are crimes of the pen as deadly as those of the blade," he said softly. "Sir Alaric Dane murdered not in rage, but in authorship. To him, the act was composition, the blending of art, intellect, and control. Each stroke of his quill was a rehearsal for the fatal gesture that would end her life. And when she died, he applauded himself." He tapped the manuscript lightly. "The proof lies here. The annotated drafts, the poisoned inscription, the foreknowledge of the play. The rest is silence, just as he intended. I remember watching him then, the light falling across his austere features, and feeling a chill unlike any other. For in that moment, I understood what Holmes meant, that even genius, when divorced from conscience, becomes the most exquisite form of cruelty. And in the soft rustle of paper upon his desk, I fancied I heard the whisper of Clara Dane's final applause. The theatre lay half-shrouded in dusk when we arrived, its gilded ornamentation dulled by the failing light, and its silence deeper than any I had known within its walls. Holmes had summoned every soul connected to the tragedy, the actors, the stagehands, the property master, and Sir Alaric Dane himself, under the pretext of a final inquiry. Inspector Lestrade hovered in the aisles like a watchful shade, his notebook at the ready. The gas jets hissed faintly, casting a pallid glow over the empty stage where tragedy had played its last performance. Holmes moved with deliberate composure, his coat glinting faintly in the half-light as he addressed those assembled. "Tonight," he said, "we shall rehearse not for entertainment, but for revelation. The theatre, my friends, has ever been a house of illusion, but truth, once lit, casts the longest shadow." His voice carried across the silent rows of seats. I felt a shiver that owed nothing to the chill in the air, for it seemed to me that Holmes had become both playwright and judge in a drama more terrible than any ever staged here. At his command, the company took their places upon the stage. The scene was set as it had been on that fatal evening, the props restored, the lighting dim, the air thick with nervous energy. "We shall begin at the final act," Holmes instructed, his tone even yet charged with an unspoken urgency. "Each of you will repeat your movements exactly as before. Nothing altered, nothing omitted. The stage remembers what the conscience forgets." I stood at the footlights, notebook in hand, while Holmes drifted among the performers, his eyes noting each gesture, each hesitation. The faint echo of remembered applause seemed to tremble in the rafters. Sir Alaric watched from the wings, pale and still. "Proceed," said Holmes. The actress playing opposite Mrs. Dane lifted the stage prop, a glass ornament shaped like a vial, and placed it upon the table with careful grace. The others continued, their lines half-spoken, their eyes darting towards Holmes as if seeking approval. Yet he gave none. Instead, he raised a hand. "Stop there." His voice cut the air cleanly, and the scene froze as if turned to wax. Holmes stepped forward, his gaze fixed upon the table where the prop now rested. "Here," he said, "is the moment that divides imitation from intent." He pointed to the ornament with his cane. Mrs. Dane, by the script's direction, was to lift this trinket as the curtain fell, a gesture of symbolism, a reconciliation of art and life. Yet life, in this case, was poisoned long before the applause. He turned to the property. "Master." "You, sir, place this item before the performance?" The man stammered an affirmative. "But it was not this one you placed," Holmes continued. "You were summoned away by the playwright himself moments before the curtain rose, were you not? And when you returned, the ornament had already been arranged." The stagehand's face blanched. Holmes bent, lifting the object delicately between thumb and forefinger. A change so slight as to escape all notice, save one trained to watch for substitution. The drama was written twice, gentlemen, once upon the page and once upon the stage. From his pocket, Holmes produced a small parcel wrapped in tissue. Unfolding it, he revealed a second ornament, its shape identical to the one upon the table. "Two props," he said softly. "One pure, one fatal. Upon this surface," he touched the glass with a gloved hand, "I found residue of the same substance that claimed Mrs. Dane's life. Aconitine in infinitesimal quantity, but sufficient when handled repeatedly to penetrate the skin." I felt a chill as he placed the two side by side. "You will note the faint clouding upon this one," he continued. "A natural result when oil from the hands mingles with an alkaloid compound. The other remains clear. The poison used upon the glove, the ink, and this ornament share the same chemical signature. They are all variations of one preparation, crafted not in haste, but with meticulous artistry. Lestrade exhaled softly, the sound harsh in the silence. "Good Lord, Holmes," I murmured. "The entire performance, engineered to kill." "Precisely," Holmes replied, his eyes darkening. "And only one man could have designed so intricate a tragedy." Holmes turned then towards Sir Alaric Dane. The playwright's face was ghostly in the gaslight, his hands clenched upon the rail of the orchestra pit. "You alone," Holmes said quietly, "knew the precise sequence of gestures. You alone revised the blocking after your wife's final rehearsal. You placed this prop upon the table yourself, ensuring she alone would touch it. The script, your script, called for her to lift it in farewell, her fingers lingering upon its surface. You directed her to her own death, Sir Alaric, and dressed it as genius." Dane's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Holmes's tone remained calm, even sympathetic. "You sought not her silence, but your immortality. To make your art live, you chose that another must die. Yet your artistry betrayed you, the ink, the glove, the prop, all threads of the same tapestry." The silence that followed was unbearable. I could hear only the slow ticking of the stage clock. Holmes laid the poisoned ornament gently on the table, as one might lay down a verdict. Sir Alaric Dane's composure broke like glass under strain. His head bowed, his hands trembled, and his voice, when it came, was that of a man speaking from the ruins of himself. "Yes," he said, the words scarcely audible. "I wrote it so. I thought to end her torment, and mine, with beauty. She feared my imagination. She said it had begun to breathe through her, to claim her thoughts. I wished to free her from it." He gave a hollow laugh. "A perfect act, Holmes." The audience applauded. They wept. She died as she had lived, upon the stage. His gaze lifted briefly, the shadow of his former arrogance flickering for a moment. "It was not murder. It was creation." Holmes's face did not soften. "Creation, sir," he replied, "requires life, not the theft of it. You mistook control for genius. The line between art and cruelty is thinner than ink, and you crossed it without pause." Dane sank to his knees, the words striking him like a sentence. Lestrade advanced quietly, his hand upon the man's shoulder. "It is done," said Holmes. "The play is over." When all had departed and the stage lay silent once more, Holmes and I remained. The gaslight hissed faintly, throwing long shadows across the empty seats. "There are tragedies, Watson," Holmes said at last, "that are applauded without understanding. To the audience, it was art. To the victim, it was love turned tyrant. And to the perpetrator, it was genius unrestrained." I closed my notebook, the sound echoing faintly in the vast space. "You pity him," I said. Holmes's expression was unreadable. "Pity is the luxury of those untouched by vanity," he answered. "I do not pity him, but I understand him. The artist who kills for immortality dies by the applause he craves." He glanced once more at the darkened stage. "Let us go, Watson. The curtain has fallen, but the echo will remain." As we stepped into the night air, I could still hear that echo, the ghostly murmur of unseen hands applauding a masterpiece that had murdered its muse. The night had drawn its grey curtain over London, and the rain descended in a slow, unceasing veil that blurred the lamps of Baker Street into trembling halos of gold. Within the familiar room, the hearth burned low, and Holmes sat motionless before it, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed not on the flames, but upon the dim reflection of the street beyond. The rhythmic tapping of rain upon the glass seemed to mark the passage of thought rather than time. His violin lay untouched beside the armchair, as though even music were too crude an outlet for the emotions that stirred beneath his calm exterior. I took my accustomed chair opposite him, unwilling to break the silence, yet feeling the strange weight of that day pressing upon us both. The fire crackled softly, and the room, so often the stage for our most restless adventures, had about it now the hush of something ended, something not yet forgotten. Holmes did not move, but I sensed that his mind was still at the theatre, where tragedy had taken its final bow. I have often found that the stillness after action weighs more heavily upon the spirit than the deed itself. That evening, the hush of Baker Street seemed charged with the residue of that grim performance, the silence after applause, when reflection replaces wonder. I sat by the window, my pen idle above the journal that lay open before me, uncertain whether to record the events as a case or a confession of the human heart. Holmes had spoken little since our return, yet even in his silence, I perceived that the echoes of that cursed theatre still lingered about him. The rain outside mimicked the soft murmur of an unseen audience, while the fire cast flickering shadows that resembled figures bowing in perpetual farewell. I could almost imagine the ghost of Clara Dane taking her final curtain call, her tragedy complete, her truth untold, except to us. For once, the triumph of deduction had left neither satisfaction nor pride in its wake, only an odd melancholy, as though reason itself had witnessed its own limitations. It was Holmes who finally broke the spell. His voice emerged from the half-dark like a measured chord, deliberate and toneless. "The artist who kills for immortality," he said, "is only half a murderer. The rest is vanity." The phrase fell into the silence with such precision that it startled me more than a shout might have done. I looked up, and his gaze remained fixed upon the rain-streaked window, his profile lit faintly by the fire's dying glow. "He sought not her death," Holmes continued, "but his own permanence. To such a man, love becomes an instrument, life a stage direction, and death merely an act of authorship." I shuddered inwardly at the calm certainty in his tone. "And yet," I ventured, "you pitied him." "Naturally," he replied, his eyes distant. "He mistook creation for power, and power for worth. A common delusion, Watson. Mankind has never quite learned that beauty bought with suffering is counterfeit." The rain answered him softly against the glass, as though the city itself mourned for both victim and villain. Holmes's words lingered in my mind long after they were spoken. There are moments, I reflected, when the boundary between admiration and cruelty becomes perilously thin. Genius, in its highest form, demands detachment, and yet it feeds upon emotion. The two forces entwine like ivy about a crumbling wall, beautiful but destructive. I had seen that truth in Sir Alaric Dane's hollow eyes, in the ruin of his art and his heart alike. How often had I wondered whether the same flame that illuminated Holmes's mind might, under some darker influence, consume him also. His was the genius of clarity, not creation. Yet even in him there was a kind of loneliness that bordered upon the tragic. I closed my journal halfway, feeling the futility of words before such contradictions. "It is a curious thing," I said softly, "how love and intellect conspire to undo what they most desire to preserve." Holmes stirred slightly, but his expression did not change. "Perhaps," he murmured, "because both believe they can perfect what was meant only to be imperfect." For a long while, Holmes remained silent. Then, leaning forward into the glow of the fire, he said, "There is but a paper wall between logic and sympathy, Watson, and both are easily set alight. Sir Alaric crossed that line when he began to reason about love as though it were a formula. In so doing, he mistook dominance for understanding." His eyes turned toward me, searching. "Do you think me cold, Watson?" I met his gaze steadily. "No," I said, "but you are safer than most who feel deeply, because you do not mistake feeling for truth." He smiled faintly, the ghost of amusement touching his lips. A distinction Mrs. Dane would have appreciated, too late. He rose, pacing once before the fire. Man's mind, when unrestrained by compassion, is a scalpel without a healer's hand. Precision may cut cleanly, but it cannot mend. His tone softened. In art, in love, and in justice alike, sentiment must temper intellect, or intellect will devour them all. I said nothing. There was wisdom in his melancholy that required no reply. The lamplight had grown dim, and the steady drumming of rain upon the panes deepened into a kind of lullaby. Holmes stood at the window, his reflection merging with the darkness beyond. Art ends where truth begins, he said at last, half to himself. The one seeks to deceive beautifully. The other cannot deceive at all. Mrs. Dane lived in the former, died for the latter. He turned toward me, his features softened by the glow of the dying fire. And yet, he added, it is only through her death that truth found a voice. His gaze drifted again to the rain. In my mind's eye I saw the deserted theatre, the empty box where she had fallen, the stage dim and echoing, the dust settling over the trappings of illusion. The tragedy was over, and yet something of it remained suspended like music unresolved. I felt a strange tenderness toward both victim and culprit, bound together in their fatal misunderstanding of art's purpose. Yes, I murmured. Truth has no curtain call. I finished my entry by lamplight, my pen scratching softly in the silence as Holmes resumed his watch by the hearth. Outside, the rain persisted, steady and unjudging, as though London itself sought to cleanse what neither reason nor remorse could undo. Creation, I wrote, is the mirror of conscience. When the reflection darkens, the soul mistakes its own shadow for the image of God. I paused, listening to the faint crackle of embers, and looked toward my friend. He sat perfectly still, his face half lit, half lost to shadow, an emblem of the very balance he so often sought between intellect and humanity. I felt a deep gratitude then, not only for his mind but for the quiet moral gravity that guided it. Closing my journal, I watched as the flame dwindled to a single ember. The rain fell without end, soft and rhythmic, like distant applause fading into eternity. And thus ended the case of the death of the playwright's wife, not with triumph, but with understanding and with silence. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the faint gleam of the dying fire reflected in his eyes. You see, Watson, he said quietly, the tragedy of Sir Alaric Dane was not that he murdered his wife, but that he believed genius excused the act. Vanity, when it dons the costume of intellect, is the most dangerous of disguises. He drew thoughtfully on his pipe, the smoke curling like pale ribbons above the hearth. He sought immortality through art and found only oblivion through pride. I watched him in silence, struck by the calm finality of his words. Outside, the rain whispered against the window, as though London itself were offering its own sombre applause to the performance that had ended so grimly. And now, dear listener, I wonder, what do you think was the playwright's gravest sin? Was it the crime itself, or the belief that beauty could justify it? If this mystery has stirred your thoughts, share them below. Subscribe for more tales from Baker Street, and perhaps pass this one along to a friend who loves a riddle draped in fog. The case is closed, but the questions, as ever, remain.